Good morning. Can everyone hear me all right? Gorgeous. I'm happy to talk to anyone after about Gen Z and millennial cusp and why it's very important to me. It has a lot to do with VHSs and fast-speed internet. I could go on forever. We'll chat afterwards. Thank you so much for having me. It feels very surreal to be speaking here, and this is as my Poppy said. I probably made my first appearance here weeks after I was born, and spent a lot of time running up on this stage and running around and eating at the diner around the corner. So I feel very grateful to get to spend some time with you this morning. Also, I'm getting over a little bit of a dry cough, so apologies if I take a sip of water or coffee, because it is the morning, and I am not usually awake. Well, I'm usually just waking up around now. A lot of when I reflect on my time here and also my time in Quaker school, I went to 2 different Quaker schools from 1st through 12th grade. In reflection, a lot of what I've realized is that baked into who I am and how I think about working, sort of even outside of theater or any artistic discipline, is really valuing the person, valuing people you are working with, people you are surrounded by, thinking collectively and community-based, and leading with softness and with care and friendliness. Which I don't think at the time I was even remotely aware that was how I was being brought up or how I was being trained or how I was thinking about how I walk through the world. But in a lot of reflection and conversation with my peers, I've realized that sort of is the thing that stands out, that people often have to put a lot of time and intention into learning and adjusting about themselves. And I feel very grateful that my time being raised as an ethical humanist and through Quaker education sort of instilled those values in me from the get-go. I spent a lot of time as an actor. I sort of assumed that was my primary field in life, and I went to Wesleyan acting extracurricularly, and sort of stumbled into directing. There was a 15-minute musical that I just thought would be fun if it happened at Wesleyan, and a friend was like, well, why don't you direct it? And I was like, okay, that sounds silly, but sure. And I applied to direct it, and as soon as I was directing the show, I was like, oh, actually, this is the thing I should be doing. I always was very jealous of my actor friends because they seemed to be able to disappear into roles and be very present, and block out everything else that was happening so they could just connect with their scene partners. And I realized, like, truly one of my first rehearsals I led as a director, I realized that I was never able to do that because I was always directing myself. I was always, a little part of my brain was outside of myself, giving myself notes and thinking about everything else going on. And actually, if I just stepped off the stage and looked at it from the audience, I was able to see everything so much clearer. And it was already what I was doing anyway. And so I really, full speed ahead, committed to directing, and have been pursuing that ever since. But to spool back a little bit more, I initially got excited about theater specifically, or I guess, again, in retrospect, realizing why I was interested in theater, is that it is all about storytelling. It's all about talking about who we are as people, as a community, as a human race, in what I think is one of the most collaborative ways possible. Not only, I mean, certainly for the collaborators who are working on the piece, the artistic side, you have to really all be on the same page to create something that, yes, is repeatable, but also happens in a certain time in a room. The lights will you know, as someone I was talking to at one point, a director called it a time-based art form, which I had never really thought about. But the idea that literally everyone has to experience it in a certain amount of time, every second that is happening, you can't pause it, you can't rewind it. Whatever you are watching that moment is the thing happening at that moment. So you have to create it with your collaborators to be repeatable, but also flexible. But also you have to show up as an audience member and be ready to sit in a room with someone for 2 hours and be present. You can't take out your phone, you can't pause, there's an intermission, but everyone takes it at the same time. And so to me, it sort of is I really think of it as humanism in art form. You have to ask people to show up and like think about who these people are, even if they're doing the most despicable things on stage, if they're being terrible to each other. You have to sit with them for 2 hours. You have to like attempt to understand them and attempt to sympathize with them without any disconnect. There's just the stage between you and them. You're just in your seat, but you are breathing the same air as them for, you know, those 80 minutes, those 2 hours. And you have to investigate who they are. You don't have another choice. And so I think getting to craft that experience, both for my collaborators who I'm working on the piece with, but also for audience members to show up and live with these characters, live with these stories for the length of the show has always really excited me and is what has kept me in working in theater. So I'm going to just take us through a couple different moments in the process as I'm directing a piece, and the way I like to approach it, the way I like to think about it. And a lot of these things come from conversations I've had with my peers, things I've realized, again, about my ethical upbringing and Quakerism. And also, in many ways, the way I'm trying to set myself and my peers, we all think, sort of my collective peer of directors around my age, the way we are trying to sort of change the way directors work and make it more collaborative and empathetic and thoughtful to our collaborators. I don't know if anyone in their mind has an idea of what a stereotype of how they think a director works or how they think a director is. I know before I knew what directing was, I always thought about it as being very cutthroat and very, you have to sort of like prove your authority. People always talk about like, oh, what's the director thinking and what's their vision, and I have to match their vision. I found with a few directors that I've worked with as an associate who I had less positive experience with, I was often trying to like guess what was in their head, and that it almost felt like a cat and mouse game. And I am like quite allergic to that way of working. In my opinion, if you have to sort of prove your authority, you maybe have just not connected with your collaborators enough for them to trust you. So I really try to approach directing work as an artistic facilitator, an artistic leader. So I do walk in often with like a pretty strong vision for what I think the show should look like or show should feel like. A lot of my job is connecting with my team of designers. That would be lighting, sound, scenic, costume, sometimes video, and making sure we are all on the same page and we're all sharing that vision, as well as connecting with the ensemble of actors I'm working with, leading everyone through discussion and through crafting of what our process is so that we're working towards that same cohesive show. If it's a piece of new writing, working with the writer, the composer to adjust to make sure that what they are writing, again, matches the vision of the show and that we're working towards the best possible version of the piece. And then often a director serves as the main conduit between the producers and the actual art form itself. So the people who are like logistically making the thing happen, and then the people who are like sort of boots on the ground in the room building the show. And so through these little bits of the process I'm going to talk us through, my goal, the place I'm always sort of approaching each one of these moments in the process are about valuing the people in the room first, both their, the literal human beings walking into the space, making sure it's a positive experience. We don't get paid enough in theater, so it's not worth it to have it be a negative experience. We all decided to pursue this thing we love, so I want it to be something that hopefully brings people joy. And then by valuing the integrity of the piece second, whatever the piece is trying to be, whatever our collective vision for the piece is, always bringing it back to the story and the characters, because I think sometimes we can get very wide-eyed, or it can become about ego, for the director, for other collaborators. And so my goal is always to hone it back and let it be about the actual story that we're building. So often the very first step when I'm like actively on a process is having conversations with designers. And that can take many different forms. It is, and many times, the most sort of nebulous piece of the process. You're not in a rehearsal room. You sort of have to find times to talk with them, and sometimes the piece isn't fully finished being written yet. So I always try to start by just talking about the show itself, as opposed to like their specific design elements. So when I talk to the scenic designer or the costume designer or the sound designer, usually our first 1 or 2 conversations, we're just talking about the play, not even necessarily about the design that they will be doing. I found early on in my career, I tried initially talking about, like let's dig into like what the set looks like, and then they would do all of this work and present me with a whole model or a drawing, and it would be totally wrong, like not the vibe at all, and they'd have to scrap all of that, and we talk about it, and they start over, which is a waste of their time, and not useful for anybody. So I find that just by having conversations about the piece, we can actually all get on the same page from the get-go. We let the artistic work stem from, again, the sort of story itself, the characters itself, and if we are all approaching the story in the same way, their design will automatically be serving the collective vision that we're having. I often find it's about finding shared vocabulary, which is different for each designer, but we sort of will find like certain words that will be our words that we'll now use. A play I just did called "You Don't Have to Do Anything." The designer, it was our second time working on the piece. We had a really good collaborative relationship. We had a really good idea of what the piece was. And they had all of these like fun elements of the set. There were this chair back there, and there was this light up thing over there, and there was this thing coming down. And a word that we found early on in our conversations was essentializing, and realizing that we just needed to like make this piece specifically just wanted to be like the essential elements were on stage. We didn't need any sort of accoutrements or any other decoration. Other plays maybe, but this play just didn't need that. And because we had that word, we just kept on coming back to it through the whole process. Every time there was like that chair, and she was like, yeah, essentializing, it's gone. And it allowed us both to sort of put our egos aside. It let us think about the story first. It let us think about, the actual story that we were telling. And it also, I think sometimes when you don't have that shared vocabulary, things can feel very personal, especially like my job as a director is to give people notes, and that is, I think, something that can always feel very personal. I just like come in with my like strong opinions and say, change these things. And when we have shared vocabulary that is bringing it back to the story, it doesn't need to be about ego. So I think for a set designer to say like, hey, cut half of your set, that has the potential to sting. But because we had vocabulary that gave us reason for why we were paring things back, that made it about the story, that made it about the design, it was about the collective work we were doing. It was about telling this shared story. And ultimately, the set design was really, really strong, and people mentioned it in reviews, and people talked about it afterwards. And I think had we not sort of built that relationship with each other, had we not built that shared vocabulary and really approached each other as artists sharing this piece as opposed to like the director and the designer who both want to show off their directing and design, the whole piece actually would have just been a little bit more muddy. The vision would have been more muddy. Once you nail down design, you sort of figure out what the piece is going to look like, you get into the rehearsal process, you start approaching the rehearsal process. You have to start thinking about what actors you're bringing into the space. And I find also casting is something that has the potential to, I have a lot of sympathy for actors. It is a really, really hard field of work. It is also like it is the least about who you are as a person and the most about like what you're bringing into the room or how you audition, which I think is so hard. The fact that you just show up in a space and like show what you can do, and then other people decide if you're good enough or match the thing enough to be in the show or be in the project. So that's the first thing I always try to remind myself is I think, especially when I'm seeing my 25th actor of the day, 30th actor of the day, they're singing the same, 20 seconds of that song I've now heard over and over again. I think it's really easy to get cynical, and it's really easy to sort of turn your brain off. And so I try to always remind myself, just because it's my third hour or fourth hour or second week or whatever, we're trying to cast this piece, it is their first time walking in, and it is their one chance to show whoever's behind the table what they can do. So I try to, as much as I can, turn my own brain on and reminding myself of that. I try to greet every person who comes in. Something I learned from the director I've been working with on Merrily when I was in callbacks for that show is she would get up and shake hands of each actor and then go around and introduce every single person in the room, including the casting assistant behind the camera and the pianist who would be accompanying them. So that way it was just, okay, we all know each other's names. She'd let them sort of sing their song at the piano, and she would turn to me and she's like, okay, we're gonna talk to each other now. We don't really have anything to say, but I want them to not think that I'm staring at them and judging them right now. So we're gonna have a conversation. And I was like, okay, great, we're having a conversation. And then they would be ready and she'd be like, okay, now let's listen. Because I think, because yes, every moment you're in the room is the audition, but I think just as much as you can de-stress, de-escalate the process for them, the better. And the other thing I always try to remind myself is I think, again, once you're on your 30th, 35th, 40th actor, it's really easy to be like, okay, they start talking, I know immediately whether this will work or not. I have a really strong idea of what this character needs to be. And I have to consistently remind myself, this is something that my directing professor in college really taught us, is it's actually less about what they are immediately bringing in and more about how they work with you and what their potential is. So even if I think they're not quite right, I will always try to give them an adjustment, a note, see how they respond to it. Even if someone's perfect, give them adjustment. And if they're you see their walls go up, you're like, okay, maybe this will not be the most fruitful experience for us over these next 3 weeks if you're resistant to collaboration. But then the people who you give an adjustment to and they're excited about it, they talk about it, or they find something new, or a little gem of something pops up that you didn't see before. That is really useful information. I also try to see if I am getting stuck in an idea of what the character should be. Have I pictured some famous actor and I'm just trying to see who's the closest version of George Clooney in this role? Or can I adjust the way I'm seeing these actors walk through the space and thinking, okay, what is your version of this character? If I brought you into the space, what are sort of your 3 superpowers that you would bring in that would make your version of this character different than someone else's? It takes a lot of coffee drinking, a lot of hydrating, because I find it's especially in these very dark rooms, there's no light coming in. But I think I owe it to every single one of those people to come in to think as broadly and to give them as much room for potential as possible, so that they can just show up and do their best work. There's a piece I did a couple years ago, a play by the British playwright Carol Churchill called A Number, which was a two-person play, and it was a man who played a father and then a younger actor who played 3 different clones, and they cycled through scenes. It was wild. And so this one actor needed to play 3 different characters back and forth all around. And we brought in a bunch of actors, and a lot of them were quite good, very similar sort of tall, scraggly, handsome men who all were excellent. And then there was this one actor who was a sort of shorter, long-haired, non-binary actor who was really weird and just had these very, very different takes on everything. And the casting director and the producer I was working with both were okay, well, obviously that's not right? We found we have all these other people, that person is not right for the role. And I sort of like, I was like, yeah, sure. And then I thought about it, and I was like, no, their take is so different, and I think brings a whole other flavor into the piece, different than the thing I initially set out to do. But I was ultimately most excited about what they brought into the room. I was most excited by the way we were able to collaborate when I was giving them notes. And I ended up casting that actor, and they gave a stellar performance. And it was a very different show than if I had gone with sort of the type that I had thought about before. We get into the rehearsal room. I'm not going to talk about like blocking and staging the piece, because I think that sort of gets a little bit like, okay, I tell people where to go. It's more complicated than that, but less exciting. The thing I find really fun, which I've sort of learned is not a piece of the process that I think a lot of people know about who are not intimately involved in theater, is what's called table work, which is often the first 4 to 5 days of the rehearsal. Often is just sitting at a table with chairs, script open, reading through the play very, very, very slowly, and talking about it. And I think it is so much more important than anything we do once we get up on our feet. Interesting visuals are exciting, interesting staging is exciting, I love it, my bread and butter. But if the cast is not all on the exact same page, again, of the story we are collectively telling, they might stand in the right places and be lit well and be dressed well, but they will all be in different worlds. They'll all be like telling their own stories, and their characters will be, you know, living whatever lives they're leading in whatever version of stylization they're living in. And so table work I find to be so crucial, because it is my opportunity to facilitate the room to make sure we are all stepping into the exact same story together, that we're all approaching the material in the exact same way. I think a lot about sitting upstairs here or around the corner at the diner during our Yes Sunday meetings when I was in the youth group here. And we'd often like come in each week with some sort of world topic or some, you know, ethical dilemma, which are hard things to talk about, and I think especially hard things for 14 to 17-year-olds to talk about. And figuring out how to best approach those conversations in ways that honor everybody in the room, honor everyone's opinion in the room, gives everyone an opportunity to speak, gives people an opportunity to step back if they need to step back. Let moments be teachable if someone's sort of walking in and is not exactly on the same page as everyone else. And so I think about the skills I honed in those meetings, and I think I apply a lot of them to when I'm doing table work as a director. I find myself drawn often to plays that deal with heavy themes, to darker themes. I've realized I just enjoy talking about ethics, and it's easy to talk about ethics when people are doing unethical things. Those are tricky conversations to have. So being really intentional about, giving people the opportunity to step in or step out, trying to pull people in when they are sort of keeping everyone at an arm's distance, figuring out how to both articulate my vision and what all of that work I just talked about, making sure that these actors who are now new to the process are also learning that and taking that. And again, keeping as active an ear as I can, being as malleable as I can, because oftentimes people will come in and be like, here's a radical new idea I have about this character, and sometimes it is the best idea. And a phrase I talk about often with my directing peers is we have seen mentors of ours approach with saying like director's idea is best. They don't literally say that, but that's the vibe. And I really try to approach with a best idea and the room wins. And probably 90% of the time, mine is not the best idea. I am one human being, I am one brain, and I'm walking into a room of, up to a dozen, 2 dozen people. There's no world in which my idea is, even the majority of the time, going to be the best one. What I can do is keep my ear open and try to intake everything, fit it into the giant puzzle that's in my head of what this show is or could be, and take us down a path if we need to change what the path is, if we need to make a right or a left as opposed to going down the straight path that I had envisioned. I try as best as I can to be really transparent as well. Like as I talked about earlier, I just really have a hard time with directors who like keep things hidden away and then like reveal things later on, because I'm like, okay, that would really helpful information for me to know a week ago. So I'm like, I try to approach saying, okay, here's all the work we've done. Here's how I'm thinking about the piece. And that gives people the best sort of fighting chance to come in with the best idea, for them to be brainstorming and do their own research, and through the conversation we have actually lead us to a new and better product. Again, this is why I enjoy theater so much, is I just truly, truly do believe that if I was doing an artistic discipline that was totally by myself in my own room, it would be like just okay to mediocre. And I think what's so beautiful about theater making and collective art making is that it is about everyone bringing in their best selves. And the thing I find the most joyful about directing is I get to like be the person who picks out all of those gems. I get to say like, oh, like the way you're approaching this character is so beautiful. Let's all, look at what this actor is doing. That's really incredible. But the way you're talking about this play is beautiful. Let's put our brain there. And you get to, we get to pick out all the best little bits of everything and have a more beautiful product. And then finally, you get through the rehearsal process and you go into what's called tech, which is the sort of highest stakes, highest stress point in the process. Because you get into the theater, it's when everyone is like enacting all their things. The set is built, costumes are on people, the lighting designer is, I don't really know what they do. They type furiously into computers and magically lights are on people. The sound designer is adjusting things because they understand how sound works. And we have to be moving things along because there's never enough time, and there's an audience coming in X number of days. And I think this is the point in which it becomes very, very easy to forget people's humanity. It's really easy to take advantage of people's time. This is when people get a little snappy. And so, and I also will say it is the time in which I have, in some ways, the most power, and in some ways the least, because again, my job is sort of to sit and absorb it all, and then give people thoughts. So as the lighting designer is typing furiously away, I just sit there and have opinions about it, then they actually have to do things about my opinions. So I try to, there's also this thing called the God mic, which is only a couple people in the room have it, and it's the microphone that then is on all the speakers, and so there's just a lot of power. And so I always try to bring it back. I try to tell jokes during breaks. I try to the people who I have the kind of relationships with where I can sort of poke fun at them, and we have a good back and forth banter. I try to bring that into the space. Any sort of inside jokes, laughter we have from rehearsal, I try to bring in, because I think sometimes it's really easy for rehearsal room versus the theater to feel like very separate spaces, and I think it's important to feel like they're connected. And then I always try to bring it back to the story, because when you're worried about whether that costume change will happen, or whether that light is looking the exact way it's supposed to, or whether, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think it can be really easy to forget the big picture. So I think about my job as thinking about the big picture, thinking about the conversations I had, 4 or 5 months ago, that first conversation I had with the designer, that first conversation I had with a writer, and trying to keep that in the space so that we do all the little things, but we're doing all the little things because we're building a big thing together. I think that's a good pausing place.
It's a wonderful pausing place.
Great.
But only a pause. So we have about 10 minutes for people who might have questions, or you'd like him to expand on some of the things that he has said, or maybe he didn't speak about that you'd like to hear something. So is anybody here in the, let's do it on Zoom first, since the people in the room have an opportunity to talk to Ryan afterwards. People on Zoom do not. So Joan, who do we have? Nobody on Zoom? Okay, so who in the room? Lorraine, do you want to come up, or I can give you the mic? Question? Question only?
This is so exciting. Thank you so much. And I have a question about the table read. So you walk into the room, everybody's sitting there around the table. What is the first things you say to them? Do you give them your vision? Do you just launch in and let's start, with the script? I'd love to know about that.
Yeah. The very first thing I do, actually, which I didn't mention, but I think is I enjoy, is again something I brought both from here and from Quaker education, is a moment of silence. That's a very Quaker thing to do, and of course, we have our silent reflection here. And I was literally just thinking about it as I was sitting in the chair, about how rarely nowadays I sit in silence in my day-to-day life. And it's something I just started doing in the last couple of years because I was thinking about that. I went to I was thinking about Quaker meeting. Yeah, we so rarely sit in silence. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but we so rarely sit in silence and self-reflect and just let there be a separation from our lives outside of a room versus our lives in the room we're sharing together. So that's the very first thing I do, which always throws everyone off, and they're like, "What are we doing?" But just so we can breathe the same air for a few seconds and think about whatever's bothering us, and then put it in a drawer for the next couple hours. And then I like to ask people, I think more to your question, their thoughts on the piece, because I think it's really easy for me to sort of go off on a tangent and ramble and whatever, and I'm sure there's some things that will be good that I will have said maybe, but I think it's so much easier to connect with someone if I'm connecting with them about their thoughts specifically, or how they're approaching the thing, and that sort of gives me, they get to paint the door that I get to then walk through. So I try to ask questions, and from there talk about whatever my vision is, and then we read the play.
Elka?
I'm also happy to repeat the question back if that's easier.
Well, it's up to you. Elka, do you want to come up? Go.
Ryan, I love the way you weave humanism into your job. You bring out the best in each person, even though they may not get the job, but I love the way this human aspect that you focus on. But I have a practical question. How did you survive this strike?
Oh, yeah.
Good question.
Thankfully, the strike didn't really affect the theater world too much because it was film and TV actors. In some ways, it actually allowed, not necessarily projects I worked on, but sort of larger scale Broadway shows. A lot of actors who usually would be busy filming a movie or a TV show suddenly were available and were like, yeah, I'll come back and do theater for a minute. So the strike ultimately didn't affect us too much. The big thing that affected us, I think, more than the film and TV industry was the sort of first year of the pandemic, because of how, theater's about being in person, theater's about being in a room with people, and obviously that didn't happen for a while. So I did a lot of Zoom theater for about a year, which gave me experience, let me meet people, which was great. But I'm very grateful that I get to be in rooms with people now.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
My name is Rick. If you had an exceptionally creative actor, I'm thinking of someone like Robin Williams. How would you, he has tremendous creativity. How would you handle that if he was one of the actors in one of your productions?
Yeah. That's someone who gives that much is the biggest gift in the world. And I think something that I when I was in college and studying directing, I always thought directing was all about like getting things out of people. So like, how can I get the best, set up the best possible scenario to like, get the thing I see underneath and chip it away, which I think is still, 75% of the work, right? Is seeing potential and trying to get there. But whenever you are gifted with the opportunity to collaborate with someone who is that giving, who has so many different ideas, and just approaches the work with generosity, the job actually becomes so much easier because it's like, great, let me just pick the best version. If you're giving me 5 different excellent, takes or line reads or ideas on the character, my job gets to just be about facilitating and honing in. So I just, that working with an actor like that is like the dreamiest thing in the world.
Okay, Sal, you have a question?
Yes, wonderful discussion. Really appreciate this insight on theater. I'm just curious, when you have 2 artists with conflicting visions on the production, how do you work with people to make sure that their contributions are, being effectively used?
Yeah, no, that it always comes up once a process that someone has a really strongly differing feeling than someone else. And it could happen, across with actors together, with designers. And it's tricky. I really try to take it on what's it called? Case by case, thank you. Case by case basis. Oftentimes the best solution is to pause, to sort of like give people a thing to marinate on and to find a time to come back to it after I can sort of check in with both people. Because I think many times it is, we have a 3-hour rehearsal, we have this 4-hour tech session. Things can become much more heated than I think people actually even are feeling about them. But because like, I have this strong thought and you have a differing thought and I only have 1 more hour before we're supposed to move on to the next scene, things can become quite intense. And so I think what I can do as a director is think big picture, think about the ways we can adjust whatever we're doing in the future so that this is less of a heated moment. The last play I worked on, there was a scene between 2 actors who just were like, every time we would run the scene and someone would be like, that was amazing. And the other person would be like, that made no sense to me. And then we like do adjustments, we'd run the scene again. And then that person was like, this was amazing. And this person would be like, well, now I don't understand the scene at all. And I was like, okay, like I don't really know how to do this. So I was like, and then we realized it was both them being like, we were just, rehearsing a scene this day and it might be the last time we touch it for a while. And I was like, okay, you know what? Let's pause here. We're obviously like in slightly different places. I need a little bit of time to actually like think about both of the opinions you're bringing in because I just wasn't in the moment able to think on my feet in a way that was useful. And I was like, you know what? In a couple of days, I know that's a scene that's going to take less time than we carved out for it. We'll return to this scene in 2 days. We came back 2 days later. Someone was a little bit more memorized. Someone else thought about the scene a little bit differently. I had some different thoughts because I now had the information that they gave me. And we were able to come up with a version of the scene, again, that was different than maybe what I originally intended, but all of us then were on the same page over how it was serving the story, and that it was serving the story. And so, yeah, time and conversation. And patience, yeah.
Ashley.
Hello.
Hi.
Very cool to have someone here under 30. Very exciting. I think it really just shows off how much you can get from coming to meetings like this. There's so much diversity in the types of things you learn about, the people that you meet. It's very cool. So, as a Zoomer to a Zillennial, thank you.
There you go. We'll talk about it after. Yeah.
We will. I have so many slang words I've never used here. But yeah. So my question is, I think, really any kind of job, I think, is a privilege in a way. working in theater, experiencing theater from the audience, from a director, from an actor is a privilege. Who do you think has an obligation to make the theater more accessible to those who are less privileged? Is it at every level something that we should be doing? Is it just the people who are not as dependent on making their way into the industry, people who have made it really big, who should be trying to help with that? Do you think that those YouTube slime tutorials are ethical? Or do you think that we should, not pirating content is the more ethical way, and there should be other methods to make theater more accessible for everyone?
Yeah. Woof. YouTube slime tutorials are it's a sort of colloquialism for pirated theatrical productions. So what people sort of film and put on YouTube, and they call it a slime tutorial because people will find it less easily. So that's what that means. No, it's such a good question. I think about it a lot because you're right. Every job is a privilege, and theater especially is a privilege. It's an art form that is not very accessible to many. If it's not something you're exposed to, I think can feel really alienating if you first are attending it. Ticket prices are astronomical. I didn't get to it today, but most of the way I earn money right now is I'm the associate director on this show, Merrily We Roll Along, which is a gorgeous show that has ridiculous ticket prices, and so I can't morally ask many of my friends to attend because it would cost them their rent money to see it. And I feel lots of ways about it because we are just now getting to the point where some theater work is paying people a living wage, and it didn't for so long. So in some way, and theater is extremely expensive to rehearse and maintain. So in some ways, I don't know if you didn't really ask specifically about ticket prices, but I feel like we both need, in some cases, the more expensive shows, and we need the more glitzy, not even family friendly, touristy, whatever shows, because hopefully that will then let someone go see something at an off-Broadway theater, that will then expose someone to go see something at an off-Broadway theater. I do think it all sort of trickles down, especially in terms of audiences. And I do think that people getting to watch, a YouTube video of Wicked that was filmed in the balcony on someone's cell phone, in some ways, that kid in Ohio who has never seen a show before, that's the only way they'll ever be able to see it. My hope is that that is only done with shows that, like a Wicked, that will not suffer from something like that. I know there are many shows that have bootlegs online that bootleg existing means someone will not go see the show, and therefore that show will close because it doesn't have the audience. So it's a complicated question, and I still am wrestling with exactly where I fall on it. But let's talk more about it after.
Okay, Ryan. Okay, well, thank you for the questions, and thank you, Ryan.